All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our grand rounds. We have a very special program throughout the day planned for everyone, but I'll turn over to Becky Seltzer to give the introduction about what this day means and our speaker.
Yeah. Thank you, Blake. On behalf of the Brenner family, his 4 children and their spouses, his 8 grandchildren, and his 16 great-grandchildren, we welcome you to Grand Rounds. Before I go into a few slides, I just wanted to thank the folks at Columbia, George Hardart particularly, who, when we called to say, could we come and bring a presentation on pediatric ethics, and we'll provide lunch and dinner, he said, yes, please come. And he's been incredibly gracious and hardworking, and particularly thank Doreen and Blake, the 2 fabulous chief residents who have helped us so much in getting this organized, and Peg Dubner, who helped make all the administrative things so smooth for us. It feels like we are part of the Columbia family now. How do we move this forward? Can you drive? Okay, so the Sam Brenner Family Fund was endowed in 2012 as a birthday gift in honor of our father's 90th birthday to provide he provided a lifelong example of ethical behavior in business. And we found that this was a way to honor him and honor his legacy. The fund has 2 goals. One is to endow and sponsor a lecture every other year. The lectures are mostly in Baltimore, where I was the director of pediatric cardiology at Hopkins for 22 years. But we take the show on the road, and we've been in Columbia at Columbia this year, and 4 years ago at NYU, where my sister is on the faculty of the business and law school. We also support the Child Life Program at the Johns Hopkins Children's Center. So this is a picture of our dad at about his 90th year. He passed away in 2021, just shy of his 99th birthday. Over the years, so the first lecture was in 2013, and we've had the pleasure of having some extraordinary speakers over the years from Yale, University of Chicago, from NYU, and we're looking forward very much to this year's presentation. Becky.
Good morning. Thanks, Joel. I'm Becky Seltzer. I'm faculty in pediatrics and bioethics at Johns Hopkins, and it's my privilege to be here today to introduce a friend and colleague, Dr. Yoram Unguru. Dr. Unguru is a pediatric hematologist oncologist with joint faculty appointments at the Herman and Walter Samuelson Children's Hospital at Sinai, the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics, and the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. After earning his MD at the Technion Israel Institute of Technology, he completed his pediatric residency at the Children's Hospital at Sinai and his pediatric hematology oncology fellowship at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C. Dr. Unguru was then a postdoctoral Greenwell Fellow in Bioethics and Public Policy at Johns Hopkins University. He is the chairman of the Ethics Committee at Sinai Hospital of Baltimore, and he directs a clinical ethics curriculum with the pediatric house staff, for which he's been awarded a Teacher of the Year award. His research includes a range of clinical and ethics, research ethics topics, including allocation of scarce life-saving medications and shared decision-making. He has served many leadership roles over the years, of which I'll just name a few. He's an advisor to the American Academy of Pediatrics Committee on Pediatric Research and the American Medical Association Council on Ethical and Judicial Affairs. He's on the editorial board of Pediatric Ethoscope and is chair of the Children's Oncology Group Bioethics Steering Committee. Dr. Unguru leads a multidisciplinary transnational working group examining the ethical and policy implications of chemotherapy shortages in childhood cancer. And amongst his colleagues, he's well known for being an avid tennis player and an all-around amazing human being. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Unguru as the invited speaker for the 2024 Sam Brenner Family Fund Lectureship and Symposium.
Good morning. Thank you, Becky, for that kind introduction. I'm always hot. If I start to derobe, please tell my Polish, Jewish, Israeli mother that I wore a suit and a tie. And you're witnessing that right now. I'll try to do my best. I'd like to thank Joel and his family for the honor of being here. I am humbled. When I asked Joel to tell me about Sam, he shared that he was a businessman and that most of his transactions were based on a handshake and trust. And as trust is a central element of the clinical relationship and something we'll be talking about today, this is very apropos. And I actually recall seeing Sam at some of the earlier symposia that were held in Baltimore. So again, it is an honor. And I have no disclosures because I do ethics. This morning, we are going to talk about the related concepts of hope, hype, and cure in clinical medicine and the impact of language and how these influence medical decision-making. And we could easily focus on cancer to examine these topics, but I prefer to view these four-letter words through the lens of sickle cell. Although the focus of the talk is sickle cell, throughout I'll give some examples of four-letter words in cancer. And this 1913 Times article is an early example of how cure is portrayed by the media. And throughout the talk, I'd ask that you think about how both we and our patients internalize these statements. A basic understanding of sickle cell would be helpful. On the left, you see a caricature of the inside of a blood vessel. On the right, you see a peripheral blood smear. You see normal cells, sickle cells. And some of the consequences of sickle cell were appreciated in a recent New England Journal article. And the authors noted that a diagnosis of sickle cell portends a lifetime of crises marked by substantial pain, infections, anemia, increased risk of stroke, and that's only half of it. Too often, we think of disease burden through our US-centric lens, but broadening this perspective to look beyond is important for reasons that we'll appreciate. How common is sickle cell vary? About each year, 300,000 kids with sickle cell are born, and as you can see from these heat maps, most of these kids are in sub-Saharan Africa, India, Mediterranean, Middle East, and in some African countries, 40% of people have sickle cell trait. Circling back to the US, there's about 100,000 people with sickle cell, and you can see most of them are in these 10 states. 1 in 365 African-American kids has sickle cell. And sickle cell is more than 3 times as common as some other genetic diseases you may be familiar with, like CF and hemophilia that we'll talk about in a bit. Given how common sickle cell is, you may be surprised that newborn universal screening has only been around for less than 20 years, but its impact has been nothing short of remarkable. Since its implementation, among kids age 1 to 4, mortality has decreased by 50%. Median life expectancy has moved from 14 to 50. And this likely is a result of early initiation of penicillin prophylaxis and just better overall knowledge. Newborn screening also allows for early identification of at-risk couples, allowing for genetic counseling for future pregnancies. Arguably, early identification and genetic counseling are good things. But in his excellent book, Dying in the City of Blues, Keith Wailoo makes the argument that genetic counseling and screening amounted to veiled eugenics in an attempt to control the Black population. And in this quotation from Keith's book that you can read for yourself, we'll see that what makes sense from a public health perspective may be viewed by certain groups as potentially problematic. Although complications of sickle cell accumulate with age, infants and kids are at risk for a lot of life-threatening complications. And by the time someone with sickle cell is an adult, because of the progression of the disease, they've likely had more than one scare. Also, these complications, they can result in irreversible organ damage and early death. And I want you to remember this idea of early organ damage or irreversible organ damage when we talk about things like gene therapy in a bit. In the US, most kids with sickle cell become adults and life expectancy is in the 50s, but you see that's still more than 20 years lower than the general population. And that mortality is highest, as the hematologists in the group know, during that critical transition from pediatric to adult care. In the developing world, it's a very different picture. Most kids in sub-Saharan Africa with sickle cell die before age 5. And in India, 1 in 5 kids dies before age 2. And you can see these disparities based upon where one simply lives. Treatments for sickle cell are divided into what we call disease-modifying agents, medications, transfusions, and those that have the chance for cure. The first drug for sickle cell, hydroxyurea, was approved in 1995 in adults. It took until 2017 that it was approved for kids. 23 years after hydroxyurea was approved for use in adults was the next medication, L-glutamine. And then in 2019, we had two drugs, crizanlizumab and voxelotor, but there's issues with both. Crizanlizumab was approved under the FDA's priority review and breakthrough therapies pathway based on a phase 2 trial. The follow-up phase 3 trial showed that it was no better than placebo in alleviating pain. Voxelotor was approved based on the FDA's accelerated approval pathway. And just 2 months ago, it was summarily removed from the market after post-marketing trials showed higher incidence of pain and death. And this is going to have, I fear, significant repercussions in terms of trust in medical people, the research enterprise. This is a slide just to show and remind us that really no part of the body is spared from the ravages of sickle cell that can cause stroke, retinopathy, heart failure, pulmonary hypertension, kidney and liver disease, immunocompromise, infertility, bony disease, ulcers. And to appreciate the frequent interactions that families with sickle cell have with the medical system, really there's no better example than fever. Kids with sickle cell, adults with sickle cell are immunocompromised. Fever is bad. Got to come to the hospital, the clinic immediately. Think how many times a kid between age 1 to 18 has a fever. You got to drop everything. You got to come in. We'll come back to this in a second. As many of you likely know, vaso-occlusive or painful crises are the hallmark of the disease. In the upper left-hand corner, you see a picture of what we call dactylitis, painful swelling of the hands and feet. And it's one of the first manifestations of sickle cell that occurs in infants. Dactylitis is also one of the only types of painful crises that you can see. This, combined with the fact that it affects infants, means that a lot of clinicians want to treat these kids. The same, unfortunately, can't be said about older kids and adults who have pain. This was Carlton Haywood, a dear colleague of ours at the Bioethics Institute. Carlton was a sickle cell researcher, educator, and champion for health equity. And unfortunately, he died on New Year's Eve 2021 at age 46 from disease complications. And among Carlton's many contributions to the field, he developed and validated a tool that showed what clinicians' attitudes to people with sickle cell are. And he demonstrated that by showing clinicians a simple video of people with sickle cell outside the hospital, outside the clinic, it decreased their attitudes. In describing the sensation of a sickle cell crisis, Carlton was eloquent as always. And in addition to this quotation that you see here, he described pain as a rainstorm of daggers. And more than half of adults with sickle cell have pain on more than half of their days. Patients with sickle cell repeatedly face stigma and bias, often from the very people responsible for their care. Patients with sickle cell are more likely to be labeled as drug seekers. Numerous well-designed studies have shown that patients with sickle cell get lower doses of pain meds than patients with cancer and arthritis. Patients with sickle cell are pejoratively called sicklers. And when we call our patients sicklers, or for that matter, asthmatics, diabetics, leukemics, we are defining the patient based upon his or her disease, which is dehumanizing, rather than think of them as individuals. This is low-hanging fruit for all of us. We can do better. When patients with sickle cell seek care for their painful crises, many physicians and clinicians simply doubt that they have pain. And studies show that this attitude is linked to cultural accounts with the drug problem in the US, even though studies also show people with sickle cell do not have higher rates of opioid abuse disorder. There's misperceptions that Black people don't experience pain like white people. So clearly there's some stereotyping going on. And then there's this issue that we don't believe people who have pain when they say they do. My patients tell me, especially when they have to go to the adult ER, not that I see many adults, but we see young adults, they feel like they have to put on their best face. So my young women patients say they put on makeup. My adult male guys say they put on nice clothes, kind of, I don't know if this is nice, but nice-ish. Imagine having to do that when you've got horrible pain and all you want to do is put on a pair of sweats. Earlier, I mentioned that sickle cell is more than 3 times as common as some other diseases like CF, but funding for sickle cell is far, far, far lower. And this is nothing new. This has been known for decades. In the late 1960s, volunteer organizations raised $2 million for CF, $8 million for muscular dystrophy, $50,000 for sickle cell. President Nixon's war on cancer allocated $2.6 billion for cancer. For sickle cell, a disease that affects 1 in 365 African-American kids, $5 million. While hemophilia is funded through national 340B drug pricing programs, no government-sponsored support for sickle cell exists. That means that the burden of defining disease falls to centers and clinicians. And because of our different priorities and our biases, we see disparities like this. And you can see CF, much less common, much more money, much more research, much more meds. As we strive to make inroads, we can learn a lot by looking back. A few slides ago, I mentioned Keith Waylu's excellent book that is looking at the intersection of politics, race, and health as viewed through the lens of sickle cell, and I highly recommend it. 1972 also saw passage of the Sickle Cell Control Act, providing funding for research, patient care, reproductive counseling. And as Keith notes in his book, for many Black Americans, the term Control Act was an ominous indicator that the real goals of genetic counseling were eugenic in nature. And these fears were well-founded beyond the historical experience. Think Tuskegee. Linus Pauling, credited with discovering the molecular basis for sickle cell, actually said and published, every person with sickle cell trait or disease have a tattoo on their forehead as a warning to the others so that the two wouldn't procreate. And it's worth reading out loud what Pauling had to say. I've suggested that there should be tattooed on the forehead of every young person a symbol showing possession of the sickle cell gene. If this were done, two young people carrying the same seriously defective gene would refrain from falling in love. Legislation along this line, compulsory testing before marriage, and some form of public or semi-public display of this possession should be adopted. And then he doubles down. In forming the opinion I presented above, I made an application of what I consider to be a basic ethical principle, the principle of minimization of human suffering. It's our duty to take these actions, the consequence of rational consideration of ethical problems. I believe that almost all ethical problems and legal problems can be solved, although often not without effort and difficulty, by application of this principle. So seeing statements like these in our leading medical journals shouldn't be surprising. People with sickle cell are confronted with inadequacy of our healthcare system, stigma, bias, mistrust, not enough treatment research options, problems with access and equity. Fast forward from Pauling in 68 to present times. Take a look in this statement at what I bolded. The emphasis on building trust and not only listening to patients, but hearing and believing what they have to say. If we expect patients to abide our recommendations, we should be willing to hear them out. This is central to central to culturally aware communication and ethically sensitive care. And there's many ways that we can listen to and believe patients. We can listen by hearing, but we also can listen by looking, not just hearing the spoken word. Hertz Nazir was a sickle cell advocate and artist who, like Carlton, died in 2021. He was 48 when he died. And through his art, he advocated for science education and sickle cell awareness. And these three paintings of his, you probably can't see them, are titled 10 Redefined, Hope, and Need Not Suffer Alone. All right, the part that you've been waiting for, 4-letter words. When discussing sickle cell treatment and research, one can't underestimate the importance of hope. But distinguishing where novel technologies like CRISPR, treatments like gene therapy live on this hope-high spectrum isn't always easy because both scientists and the media struggle. In describing CRISPR, the MIT Technology Review went so far as calling it a miracle of our age. And in this book, Editing Humanity, Kevin Davies called it the holy grail of science. Many of us likely have a sense of what hope in the medical world is. How hope is portrayed in other areas is also important. I'd like to examine how hope is portrayed in our daily lives, popular culture, the books we read, the movies we watch, the ads we're exposed to, the media. Here you see the state sign for Rhode Island, and their motto is hope. And it's thought that this comes from the New Testament statement, hope we have as an anchor of the soul. From Ann Patchett's excellent book, State of Wonder. Hope is a horrible thing, you know. I don't know who decided to package hope as a virtue because it's not, it's a plague. Hope is like walking around with a fish hook in your mouth and somebody just keeps pulling it and pulling it. This is a recent TV series based on the book some of you may have seen or read. Anyone can stand any kind of torture except hope. Stephen King's recent book, Billy Summers. It's more than a glimmer of hope now. And hope may be the thing with feathers, but it's also the thing that hurts you. And Kazuo Ishiguro's excellent book, Clara and the Sun. Hope, damn thing never leaves you alone. And here you have a discussion between the characters in the book about the protagonist, who's a girl with a life-limiting illness. Josie's condition is very concerning. Even so, I'm hoping soon she'll get better. Is that merely hoping, or is it something more solid you're expecting? Something the rest of us haven't seen? I suppose it's merely hope, but a real one. I believe Josie will soon become better. Maybe you can see things the rest of us can't. Maybe you're right to be hopeful. Maybe you're right. In this book, the main character's 4-year-old daughter has ALL, and here he's talking about the pediatric oncologist. Sometimes 4 letters mean the world. People fear being someone else's hope. I understood her, the oncologist, but I wanted her to be our hope. Just read this book a couple of months ago. The simple sharing of hope, its weight not so heavy after all, is a wonder, a lifting, a rising, a surfacing. Stefan Zweig published Beware of Pity in the early 1930s, and it was one of the last books that my dad recommended I read. So, of course, I felt compelled, because when your mom or dad tell you to read a book, you nod your head and say yes. And here he's describing the father of one of his patients, an adolescent who had lower extremity paralysis. And I've got a few excerpts, if you'll indulge me, because he does a good job. 10 times over, and I've told him I have a serious case just now in town and that it's a matter of life and death. And although he knows that, he telephones day after day and pesters me and tries to wring some hope for me at all costs. And all the time I know as his doctor how bad it is for him to get worked up like this. I have as yet no knowledge of the cure that tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, may bring, but it beats too with hope that perhaps I shall find it, that perhaps someone will discover it in time, just in time to cure my patient. He goes on, and note the use of normal to distinguish between sick. This is something that I think is intriguing. Sick people have quite a different vocabulary from normal people, that they immediately translate every perhaps into a certainty, and that one can only measure out hope to them in carefully distilled drops, or their optimism goes to their heads and makes them quite mad. And lastly, I as a doctor have to think not only of the beginning of a treatment, but of the next stage, and above all of the ultimate result. I have to take into account the reaction that would inevitably follow such wild and extravagant hopes. As a doctor, I have to remain a sober chess player. I dare not become a gambler, least of all when someone else has to put down the stakes. Movies. I caught this on a plane a few years ago. Hope is a monster, and I'm its plaything. Now, I've been waiting to talk about Batman in the Grand Rounds for years, so I finally did it. So this is Bane talking to Bruce Wayne. There's a reason why this prison is the worst hell on earth. Hope. I learned here that there can be no true despair without hope. So if contemporary fiction and movies aren't your thing, we can look to Omar Khayyam's 12th century Persian epic, The Rubaiyat. The worldly hopes that men their hearts upon turns ashes, or it prospers, and anon, like snow upon the desert's dusty face, lighting a little hour or two is gone. Shakespeare, Measure for Measure. The miserable have no other medicine than hope. I have hope that I will live, but I am prepared to die. And then lastly, Lu Xun was a Chinese poet and literary critic in the past century. Hope is like a path in the countryside. Originally, there is nothing, but as people walk this way again and again, a path appears. How is hope represented in the journals that we read, in the big journals that we read? These next examples come from physicians. When Gottfried was a cardiology fellow, her newborn son was diagnosed with meningoencephalitis. We decided to change neurologists. We found a team of physicians and therapists who gave us hope. And she captures beautifully this struggle between hope and honesty. But how can we balance honesty and hope? Could that neurologist have prepared us for the potentially devastating outcome while also allowing us to believe more was possible? When I enter critical illness conversations now, I remember my desperate need for hope when I faced a parent's worst nightmare. N, her son, has made me a better mother and physician and has taught me that we must allow hope to flourish even in the darkest of situations. Leiter is a palliative care physician, and he recounts that when he was a fellow, he was caring for a 21-year-old who, while cured of his AML, was dying of graft versus host disease. And he struggled also to balance hope and honesty. And he said to the patient's mother, I hope that his organs are going to get better, but he's going to die. And he recalls that the mother immediately labeled him as the negative one. And so he now says, I now know that hope is a generous collaborator and it can coexist with rising creatinines and failing livers and fears about intubation. As clinicians, we can always find space to hope with our patients and their families if we look for it. And then this is my beach read this summer, one of them. This is a book from last year, and he's chronicling his father's struggle with Alzheimer's. As a physician, I knew the futility of what I was doing, yet as a son, I continued to hold out some hope for understanding. A few examples from the New Yorker that drive this point home. The Fuller story was one of hope. And the only question was when that hope would be realized. In the second statement, I can't help but wonder whether this idea of selling something relates to hype. And in this third one, the tie really captures this unique link shared by science and hope. While there may be truth to the views of hope espoused by these examples, other views exist. Arguably, hope is a good thing, and because it drives so much of what we do, let's take a look and see how hope is portrayed in clinical medicine and in research. And here you can see how hope is clinical medicine and research is portrayed and leveraged. In the case of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, the name of the trial incorporates the word hope. St. Jude has an entire foundation called St. Hope, and Hope Clinical Medicine is the name of a research company. This was the voxelotor trial in sickle cell. This is the drug that was removed from the market. It too was called the Hope trial. Hope is integral to those who live with and care for kids with life-limiting illness, including families and physicians. Viewed through the prism of medical care, hope has been defined, as you see here, an inner resource, which allows individuals to transcend the constraints imposed by illness. It's a positive orientation to the future in anticipation of an improvement. For parents of a critically ill child, hope serves as a buoy that allows them to endure. Now, understandably, hope assumes different forms for parents and clinicians, and it often evolves based on the illness trajectory. Both patients and clinical teams hope for the best medical outcome, but may perceive that outcome as more or less likely to occur. A study by my colleague Brian Sisk and colleagues looked at parents' sources of hope. And for parents of kids with cancer who were the study population, they had many sources of hope, 4 of which were child-focused. Hope for cure was the most obvious, but they had other types of hope as well. And it would be really interesting to replicate Brian's study in other disease populations. And I would tell you that it doesn't matter what a kid's disease is, cancer, muscular dystrophy, sickle cell, parents' hope for cure is a powerful and motivating force. It's not lost on industry, on media, and on us as physicians as well. And understandably, many parents look to medical research as their way to achieve cure. Samuelson and colleagues found that for parents of kids with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, they viewed medical research as a miracle cure through things like stem cell treatment and gene therapy. And my colleague Rick Kodish noted that essentially any therapy that has a veneer of cutting-edge science instills and fosters more hope. What this means is that as clinicians, as researchers, we have a duty to recognize just how instrumental hope is and not dispel it. Data shows that even when parents know that their kid's dying, they are still hopeful. Remember, hope is a buoy. It's a salve. So rather than view patient and parental hope as a failure to accept facts on the ground, we may be better suited to recognize hope as fundamental while we support and foster both reasonable and reshaped hope. Exactly how far patients and families and clinicians and oversight bodies like IRBs and FDA are willing to tip this hope scale to yield advances is an important ethical and practical question. These next examples drive home the balancing act between protecting kids who get risky treatments and hope. And it's also a signpost for how we think about and approach gene therapy. In their seminal 1991 New England Journal publication, Kodish and colleagues showed the results of their study where they asked parents of kids with sickle cell, what would you be willing to exchange in return for a potentially curative bone marrow transplant? And what they found was more than a third of the parents would move forward, even if it meant risking a more than 15% chance that their kid would die in the near future. And more than 10% of the parents would do so if the risk of mortality is more than 50%. Nearly 25 years later, in the era of more widespread knowledge about sickle cell, Emily Meyer and colleagues replicated Kodish's study. They found that nearly 3 out of 4 parents would proceed with a transplant, even if it meant there was a 5% or higher chance that their kid would die. And more than 50% of them would do so if the risk of getting graft versus host disease was more than 10%. And then when adults with sickle cell were asked the same question, what would you exchange for a potentially curative transplant? Almost 2 out of 3 would do so, even if it meant a 5% chance of dying, and more than 10% would do so if it meant a greater than 40% chance of dying. So when I see this data, the first thing I think about is, man, sickle cell is a bad disease. The other thing I think about is it makes me wonder, what are patients and families hearing about these potentially curative treatments that may explain their high risk tolerance? And here's another study to drive that home. This was just published last year. This was asking adult patients and parents of kids with sickle cell the same thing, but instead about transplant, about gene therapy. And the authors concluded that both groups viewed gene therapy as favorable and were accepting of it. They also noted that patients who had more severe disease were willing to accept less in return for the gene therapy. And something really interesting is they found that parents had the highest risk threshold of all the groups. And the authors speculate that one of the reasons for that may be that some level of media coverage for hope for a better outcome. I call this hype. And I'll come back to this a little later because I've got some issues about its methodology and conclusion. Well, a few slides ago, we said that hope and hype are four-letter words, and here are a few examples of how the two are portrayed in lay and academic communities. In 2016, Eric Lander, founding director of the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, penned this op-ed in the Boston Globe, and he noted that the hope-hype contradiction highlights a thorny challenge in the ongoing conversation between scientists and the public. So let's talk about hype. Well, here's one definition of hype, and I'll qualify this as public exaggeration of the expected benefits of research. And because hype can impair decision-making, I want to take you through several examples of how medical advances are portrayed in our daily lives. So from the Times, we're in the golden age of medicine. Hype springs eternal. Can't imagine what's going to happen in 30 years. Here you see US and UK press releases extolling the virtues of that sickle cell drug voxelotor that was just removed from the market because it causes more pain and death. And I call your attention to the choice of words and language. Life-changing, transformative, landmark victory, remarkable, paradigm shift. I mean, these are terms that we usually think about: cure of polio, penicillin. Those are bold statements. Confronted with devastating diseases like sickle cell, it's not hard to see why so many of us want to believe in a better way. And this example really illustrates this fine line between hope and hype. When this 60 Minutes story aired several years ago, some patients with sickle cell thought that they were exchanging their sickle cell for HIV in order to be cured. What does this say about how information is presented, explained, perceived? Being thoughtful and careful with words applies equally to physicians and to journalists. We all have to communicate responsibly and clearly about treatments without bias, even if it risks a less sexy headline. This is a slide from Melissa Creary, who's a researcher at University of Michigan, and you can see what this doctor had to say during the early days of the sickle cell gene therapy trials. It would just open the doors of hope for these patients. In September of 21, from the New York Times, and Gina Colada has done excellent coverage of sickle cell and innovative therapies. Is cure at hand? Same time in Scientific America, 4 success stories in gene therapy. In March of 2022, from the New Yorker, are we about to cure sickle cell? And then from some of our journals, the ultimate cure for hereditary diseases, gene therapy from catastrophe to cure. As positive trial data emerged, we saw even greater use of these 4-letter words. Take a look at what Dr. Tisdale from the NHLBI actually said, and he's probably one of the smartest people out there. And then on December 8th last year, the FDA approved 2 gene therapies for sickle cell. And this quotation from Gina Colada really summarizes the challenges that families and clinicians are confronted with. Hopeful patients and clinicians are going to be constrained by the limited number of centers that can do this. Experts agree that at most centers are going to be able to do 10 a year, and it looks more like 5 a year for now. So with not enough product to serve everybody, the needed expertise, and the high cost, how centers allocate this scarce resource is a real dilemma. And right now, it is the Wild West out there. There is no guidance. So for example, CHOP has said they're going to do first come, first serve. Children's National says we're going to do the sickest first. And at least one center in Boston said, no, we're going to do this piecemeal one at a time. And so clearly some kind of national guidance or clinical criteria is needed. Some of you, we were talking about this last night at dinner, may have seen these stories about Kendra Connor, who's a kid with sickle cell at Children's National in DC, and he's the first one to get the FDA approved. And again, hope for sickle cell. I want to be cured. And then this was a follow-up study from Gina in the Times from 2 months ago. And here she covers very nicely those challenges I mentioned. Doctors, including some of your own colleagues, I'm sure could attest to the fact that the 2 companies that have these gene therapies, Vertex and Bluebird, are taking longer than what clinicians and families thought to approve them to give their their product. There's the issue, of course, of cost. Hospitals have to pay up front and then haggle. And so this statement, I think, is very apt in the article. All is not well in the world of sickle cell gene therapy. This recent piece in Nature is actually the first article I've come across, I'm sure there's others, that specifically states that transformative therapies like bone marrow transplant and gene therapy are not curative. What's meant by this is, although gene therapy will certainly reduce the acute painful crises and may even make them go away, some patients, because of the weird pain network that happens in sickle cell, will continue to experience pain for many, many months. The article also brings up some really interesting questions about identity. People with sickle cell who've undergone gene therapy no longer have sickle cell, but they may still have pain. So how they're viewed by the larger community, how they view themselves is an interesting question. Hold on. Don't believe this. All right, with all the focus and talk about cure, maybe we should define the word, but as you can see, there are more than one definition. We cannot agree. As we saw with the 60 Minutes segment on gene therapy, being careful with our choice of words and how words are used is kind of important. And this recent systematic review by Christine Grady and colleagues examined how the word cure is defined and used in sickle cell and thalassemia, two blood disorders. And Christine and her colleagues appreciated that there is no clear definition. And they also recognize that the relational nature between patient groups and clinicians and industry and media means that information from one group affects how information is accessed and understood by another. I mean, this is intuitive. And this certainly is true for cure. What to me that means is if we can't agree upon what cure means, when I talk to my patients and tell them about you're going to be cured, and I don't use that language, but I know many of us do, what I mean may not be what my patients mean. And this is a big issue. This is another very recent article that is specifically looking at how cure is thought about in the gene therapy space. And the first thing that the authors recognize is that cure is a really complicated concept. They also say something, again, that seems very, very basic, but is worth highlighting. We need to speak the same language as our patients when we're talking about so-called cure. We need to verify what their expectations are, what their goals are. Our palliative care colleagues do this all the time, and they do it very well. The authors identified three different interpretations of cure. Cure is normalization of the body, cure is obtaining a normal life, and cure is a change in identity. And take a look at this last quotation from the article. And again, you can note this link between hype and cure. And at the end of their article, in the conclusions, the authors say, you know what, when it comes to the clinical application of gene therapy, maybe we should get rid of the word cure altogether. So when talking about cure, perspective is important. For the person who's stranded on an island in the middle of the ocean, that boat on the horizon is salvation. And for that single passenger on that boat in the middle of the ocean, that island is salvation. So what might that look like in the sickle cell gene therapy space? Well, the cellular physician, the bone marrow transplanter, might define cure as persistence of the novel hemoglobin and no GVH, graft versus host. The hematologist say, no, that's not cure. Cure is where you no longer need disease-modifying treatments. And patients and families would say, no, that's not cure. Cure is resolution of pain and restoration of organ function. So before we talk about cure, maybe like this cartoon suggests, we need to put ourselves in one another's shoes and agree on a definition. Cure is big business. This is a July 2024 article. And at the time, there were more than 40 gene therapy products on the market and dozens in clinical trials. And this is certainly true in sickle cell. This is a slide prepared by my colleague at St. Jude, Akshay Sharma, and I want to thank Akshay for sharing it. And since Akshay made this slide, a number of companies have withdrawn from the market. When I asked Akshay what gives, he says, well, Yoram, it's not easy to do this. But he also told me about business interests that were at stake. Well, it wouldn't be a talk about ethics if I didn't talk about money. Well, gene therapies are among the most expensive treatments out there. Vertex's CRISPR-based gene therapy for sickle cell, $2.2 million. Bluebird's, lentiviral for sickle cell, $3.1 million. In high-income countries, paying for these is really challenging and raises countless policy considerations. But in lower and middle-income countries, it's simply impossible, let alone many of these countries don't have the expertise or the centers to do this right. Let's assume, though, that the cost is covered. What happens if that one-time infusion, remember, we're in early days, we don't know. What happens if that one-time infusion doesn't work? Should insurers cover a second infusion? And if so, 10 years out, 15 years out? Keep in mind that the lifetime related health expenditures per patient for sickle cell in the US are $1.7 million. Suddenly that high price tag maybe doesn't look so bad. We were talking about this last night. Plenty of important unanswered questions, I think, that we need to account for when it comes to equity and access. And this is one effort that the government is trying to implement to offset some of these costs. And this is a pilot program where participating centers will offer outcomes-based data, and then the government in turn will subsidize some of the gene therapy. And because about 60% of people with sickle cell have Medicaid, the thought is that this is one good example. And we'll see, it's going to start in January. This is for you, Becky. Hopefully, I've been able to convince you that hope, hype, and cure exist on a continuum. And the three really influence one another in our understanding of what they mean. The world uses hope as a marketing tool. We need to be careful about words we use, especially around words like science. We need to be clear about risks and benefits and speak about them in lay terms. We need to address the emotional risk that doesn't happen enough. And hope includes real things and emotional things. Earlier, I mentioned my colleague, Rick Kodish, and Becky and I have another colleague at the Bioethics Institute, Gail Geller, and Gail notes that medical and scientific breakthroughs often are translated, understood, and marketed as a hope for cure. And understandably, many families hold on to this hope even when the data suggests otherwise. And Gail has noted that the promise of advances in biomedical research can have a paradoxical effect. Rather than reducing suffering, the expectation of cure can be a burden. And as many of us clinicians in the group know, if cure is even remotely a possibility, many families push forward despite the cost on physical, emotional well-being, quality of life. Hope can be accompanied by anxiety. Of course, families are hoping they're going to benefit, but they also worry. Am I going to live long enough until this drug comes to market? Am I going to be eligible for the trial? What about the side effects? And when it comes to sickle cell and gene therapy, we have to ask ourselves, do families really understand when they hear the word cure that it's not going back in time to correct the damage that was already done by the stroke, by the avascular necrosis? And cure comes at a real cost. Gene therapy still, you have to get myeloablative chemotherapy that can cause organ damage. And so sometimes this is a double-edged sword. And Akshay, my colleague at St. Jude, I mentioned, some of you may have seen him recently quoted in the New York Times just about this issue. Even though I say when he's talking to patients about gene therapy, this is a dangerous therapy, high risk, you could die. No one hears that. All they hear is, I could be cured. All right, in the last few minutes, I want to share with you some data that colleagues and I who are engaged in a multi-institutional study are working on. We're interested in knowing from people with sickle cell and parents of kids with sickle cell what their perceptions and attitudes about high-risk, high-reward therapies like gene therapy are. And what we've learned has been pretty interesting. Fewer than 5% of the respondents said they felt extremely knowledgeable about gene therapy, and 2/3 said they had no knowledge. Now, maybe not surprisingly, but the more people said they knew about gene therapy, the safer they felt that it was, and they were more accepting of it. And a question that I have is, well, how is it that being more knowledgeable translates to greater willingness to accept it as a treatment? Is that because of hope? Is that because of hype? Is that something else? You remember that study I shared with you about people with sickle cell and parents who said that gene therapy was safe, accepted it, and that parents had a really high risk threshold? Well, we found the exact opposite. Families are absolutely aware of and consider the toll of these curative therapies. Of the 45 parent interviews that we've so far qualitatively coded, only 5 parents, 11%, said they thought that gene therapy was right for their kid. Of the 14 people who'd already undergone gene therapy, 2 of them said they would not do it again. And almost 60% of parents who we interviewed said they didn't think that the benefits of gene therapy outweigh the risks. And most of the respondents in our study told us that they didn't think either that their own sickle cell or their kid's sickle cell was bad enough to offset the risks, infertility, organ damage. They also just were worried about and uneasy about research, how new it is, and things that mess with your genes. And for all of us pediatricians in the group, the parents said something super interesting. They said, you know what? This is not our decision to make. It's our kid's decision to make when he or she is able to. Note the observations of these patients, namely, let's just not sell the upside. Tell us about the bad things as well. And you can also see how hope comes into this. Maybe not surprising to this group, but what we learned was how important trust is, honesty, transparency, relatability when communicating. What's relatability is many of us, as I told you, are not going to be able to do gene therapy at our centers. My center doesn't do transplant. I'm going to send my kids to you. Well, I've been taking care of this kid for 18 years. I know him. I know how his family works. They know me. Suddenly they're coming to a new group. Families want their primary teams to be engaged, and we're going to have to figure out how to make this work because we communicate so well in medicine. What are some of our take homes? Well, avoid jargon, check for understanding, give time for questions, don't rush over things, don't gloss over things. Couldn't be in New York without giving mad props to Letterman. What you're seeing here in descending order are participants' top 10 questions about gene therapy, and they may not be the same questions that we have. Again, you know, we talk about patient-centered and reported outcomes and interests, and we need to incorporate these things in our studies. So to wrap up, with others, physicians can shape and alter patient and parental hope, especially in the setting of poor prognosis. We need to be intentional in our interactions and recognize our influence. Subtle changes in how hope is understood may contribute to hype and perspectives on cure. Rather than dissuade hope, we need to respect the ranges of hope that families have. And we have to give families the opportunity and the chance to hope. By listening to and engaging with families, we can better understand what hope means. This is another of Akshay's slides that I slightly modified, and I want to thank Akshay again for using it. So we're hopeful that a lot of genetic diseases are going to have treatments. But remember, when it comes to hype, and remember about words and language, we throw around that word cure. And sometimes you'll see articles that qualify it by saying potentially. I don't use the word cure in this setting. I talk about corrective. I talked about transformative. We absolutely need more data. And then think about the kid and family in front of you. Cure may mean different things for different people. This is another slide that Melissa Creary showed when she spoke at the inaugural Carlton Haywood Memorial Symposium at Hopkins a few years ago, and it's titled The Burden of Sickle Cell. And I want to leave you with this. This was Halloween a week ago. You can see that our theme was Disney. I did my best to imitate Robin Williams, and this is one of my patients with sickle cell. We need to be humble. Take the example of crizanlizumab and voxelotor, those two meds in sickle cell. They were touted as the next best thing since sliced bread. Data showed otherwise. Patients and families with sickle cell absolutely deserve to be excited about breakthrough treatments like gene therapy. We owe it to them not to misrepresent these therapies. Thank you, and I'm happy to take some questions. And if you're curious, unlike when I dressed up as the Hulk about 10 years ago, the body paint has gotten much better. One shower, didn't leave marks. Green, on the other hand, was not pretty. It's kind of like the oil in our garage, Joel, that I was telling you about that I have to scrub. We've got a few minutes, right? I'm looking at the clock, yeah. Yes, please. Can I have that on a sticky for my mom? That I left my coat on too? This is a great question. I'll repeat the question for those who may not have heard it. For patients with sickle cell who've undergone gene therapy and who remain with chronic pain, is there, and who need ongoing pain medicine, is there a stigma within the medical community? So the first answer is As far as I know, there's very little data. What I've heard has been anecdotal and based on a few case reports. It is early days. I attended a session at the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities meeting in September, and some of the people were talking about this. My intuitive, non-evidence-based answer is absolutely. There's stigma already. And you can imagine what I've heard from some people is, we cured him of his disease. Again, if we're thinking that these treatments are curative, even though we know that the whole nociceptive pain network in sickle cell is very complicated and gene therapy is not going to do that, but clinicians have their bias in there. We've cured him. Why is he here asking for morphine? And so to me, this is going to be one of the major challenges, 100% of gene therapy. And I think we owe it to ourselves, but certainly to the patients and families, to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Yes, please.
I actually am very excited to do gene therapy for some of the sickle cell patients here. No. But I think you highlight some. I think this is great because I think that a lot of people do think this is the holy grail, and I think on some level it kind of levels the playing field for some people because. I think in the beginning it used to be if you don't match sibling well, you're kind of out of luck. And at least it kind of levels the playing field a bit. But I do think you need to temper things too. This is only for patients with pain crisis. So we don't think about people who have had stroke. We don't think about people who have had other end organ damage. And I think when you're seeing these like New York Times articles or I think people forget those things because it's a very select portion of people who can really undergo this therapy. And the trials are only about 45, 50 patients. So, it's a really small amount. And to your point about the pain, I think it's really important to tell people the endpoints of these trials are only to decrease acute pain. So many of these people are struggling with chronic pain. And not to take up everybody's time, but I had a patient who had a successful gene therapy. And she went to her local hospital because she was having abdominal pain. They just assumed she was looking for drugs. She actually needed her gallbladder out. And, it's just, these kind of things still exist.
It colors how we relate and respond to patients. Talk about implicit bias.
And, she's like, I'm like, what did they do for you? And she's like, they just gave me a prescription for Oxy. They didn't even examine me. And, she came back 12 hours later. Her
was a perf.
Yeah.
Hey.
I think gene therapy does offer a lot for our patients, but I do think you need to temper it. We have very little long-term data. We have no idea, what it means to have a fetal hemoglobin of 40%, sickle of 40%. Like what, so I think it's just important when you're explaining these. And it sounds short process, and I think I've had people think it's like a weekend expedition, and great.
Well, so part of the next phase of this, I'm a big Seinfeld fan, so this will probably go over everybody's head, but there's phase 2 of Del Boca Vista where Jerry's parents live down in Florida. So phase 2 of that grant that I just spoke to you about, we've come up with a decisional aid for patients and families of kids with sickle cell that is media-based, based on the focus group work that we've done and others. And we work with a media company that takes a patient, Leah, and you have 4 options. You have hydroxyurea, you have blood transfusions, you have BMT, and you have gene therapy. And it follows Leah through each one of those options over 20 plus years. And the idea, and there's other great ones out there. NHLBI, Vince Bonham's group has a really good setup as well. But the idea is to just give people a better taste of what it might be, and that it is not a drive-through transplant. Yeah. Yes, please. I want that on a sticky too. Thank you.
I'm one of the residents, and I'm sheepish to say I have not read a single one of the books that you quoted.
Now you have some reading to do.
So, as someone who would love to learn more about this and do better and continue learning throughout my career as this evolves, is there a particular book or reading or set that you would recommend for someone who's just starting?
Ooh, that is the hardest question I'm going to get today because it is so personal. It depends if you want an easy read between, your shifts and you don't want to have to think too much, or you want a little more heavy lifting. That, for example, that Stefan Zweig book that my dad recommended. My dad was a professor of history and science of philosophy and ideas, ancient Greek mathematics. Nothing he read in original languages, and when he made a recommendation, I was always like, oh God. And it was not as easy as Ann Patchett's book, State of Wonder. I think that I would encourage you to find a book that within the first 2 pages grabs you and go. Yes, please.
Funding, metaphor shared with the guest, they turn like war, battle, invasion, and those very these metaphors are very convincing for him in this domain, and inflate a large amount of money that goes to funding for cancer. We have none of those same metaphors for something like sickle cell. That's very exciting. Wondering if you think that although Berman makes a really good argument against using metaphor, if you think that metaphor being applied to something like sickle cell would improve the amount of funding and awareness and seriousness that will take sickle.
Yeah, great observation. The next time I come back, I've got to talk about culture and oncology. You like that next time I come back? Not for the Brenner, but yeah. There is within the sickle cell community, a lot of people with sickle cell call themselves warriors. So there is, but again, I think what you're seeing is where is it originating from? In cancer, which is very sexy, and I mean, there's a reason that St. Jude has so much money, because they advertise in everybody's backyard, and who can say no to the bald little kid with cancer? They advertise in your backyard, in my backyard, and again, I work with colleagues St. Jude, I love them, but sickle cell has a different cultural cachet, and so I do think, nothing should be polarizing, on one extreme. And so there certainly is a role and room for language and metaphor. But I will go back to what I finished up with, which is we need to be humble. We need to own what we know and what we don't know and recognize the limitations.
I think our time is up. Yoram, thank you so much. That was amazing. Thank you so much to the Brenners, the Brenner family, and for your father for making this a possibility for us. It was really special, and to Becky, of course. This is a little pitch. We're going to have more of Yoram and more of our house staff and ethics talk at the luncheon that goes from 11 to 1 in the faculty club, and there are a few still spaces available. Hopefully, everyone got the invitation with the chance to RSVP. So there are still a few spots available if you'd like more of this great ethics conversation. So I would look forward, and everyone who is coming, we look forward to seeing you there and having a really engaging conversation. That was great. Great. Huh?
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you. Of course.